Post-Gupta Bengal was a landscape defined by ash and smoke. Warlords carved through the river valleys, raiding settlements and extracting whatever wealth they could carry. Contemporary texts described this era as Matsyanyaya, the rule of the fishes. Under this logic, the big fish devoured the small fish, and the strong eternally consumed the weak. Without a central authority to enforce laws or protect trade, generation after generation was locked in a localized cycle of retaliation. The relentless violence ensured that no stable society could take root. By the middle of the 8th century, the constant warfare had exhausted the region's resources. The Delta's minor chieftains faced mutual annihilation. Facing total collapse, the rival factions did something highly unusual. The leading men of Bengal laid down their weapons and held a formal election. They chose a military commander named Gopala to be their sole ruler. That collective transfer of power established the Pala dynasty, a royal line that would govern Bengal and Bihar for the next 4 centuries. This voluntary surrender of power ended the cycle of raiding, providing the central administration with the tax base and labor force required to build a lasting regional power. Gopala's successors, Dharmapala and Devapala, leveraged that newfound stability into rapid expansion. They pushed the empire's borders out to the Himalayas in the north and the Vindhyas in the south. They channeled the wealth from these conquests into grand intellectual projects. As devout Buddhists, the Palas heavily funded the revival of Nalanda University. They built massive red brick educational complexes where 10,000 students could study free of cost. This intellectual tolerance extended into their foreign policy. The Palas established safe havens for Muslim merchants in the coastal regions, building lucrative, peaceful maritime trade routes with the Arab world and Southeast Asia. By creating a secure environment for both foreign merchants and scholars, the Pala administration secured an economic prosperity that military force alone could never achieve. Sustaining that vast prosperity proved difficult in a riverine delta. As the 9th century closed, the dense, shifting waterways of Bengal began isolating distant provinces from the capital's reach. Looking at the topography on this map, we can see how the Palas maintained their grip on the northern core of Varendra, while subsidiary kingdoms like the Khadgas and Devas began acting autonomously in the southeastern periphery. The state did not simply collapse all at once. Instead, it devolved into a multi-centered power struggle. Peripheral kings quietly amassed resources, constantly probing the central core for weaknesses to exploit. To hold on to power, both the Pala emperors and the ambitious shadow kings utilized the same political tool to secure loyalty. They gave away massive tracts of territory. This strategy, known as Brahmadeya, involved granting large estates directly to influential Brahmin priests and religious institutions in exchange for their administrative loyalty in the remote frontiers. These transactions were recorded on objects just like this copper plate. The boundaries and terms were etched directly into the heavy metal and bound with rings, serving as irreversible bureaucratic charters. In this system, a parcel of land functioned as a legal contract. By granting rights to harvest its revenue, kings manufactured loyalist pockets in hostile territory, buying the defensive alliances necessary to secure a shifting frontier. The Brahmin grantees essentially functioned as administrative outposts. They moved directly into the dense, uncultivated forests of the periphery, clearing woodland to maximize the agricultural yield. As the forests were cleared, indigenous tribal communities like the Santhals and Mundas were slowly absorbed into this expanding agrarian network, taking on new roles as peasant labor. But along with the new farming techniques came a new social order. The grantees implemented rigid, Aryanized caste hierarchies, systematically displacing the egalitarian Buddhist culture that had defined the local villages. The ruling elite's desperate need to extract land revenue had quietly initiated a sweeping cultural transition. Over decades, the region's dominant Buddhist practices were pushed to the margins, replaced by orthodox Brahmanical Hinduism. By the 11th century, the weakened Pala state was finally overwhelmed. A new power, originating from southern India, the Sena dynasty, swept across the delta to consolidate the fractured territories. The Senas operated differently from their predecessors. They identified as militant Brahma Kshatriyas, enforcing their rule not through intellectual tolerance, but through uncompromising religious orthodoxy. King Valalasena codified this approach by introducing a practice called Kulinism. It was a draconian system of social segregation that ranked the populace into a highly strict hierarchy based on perceived ritual purity. Under Kulinism, the remaining Buddhist majorities and tribal peasants found themselves locked at the absolute bottom of the state's socio-economic ladder, stripped of any upward mobility and isolated into mutually suspicious silos. The Senas succeeded in centralizing political control and mandating religious conformity. But in doing so, they completely alienated the vast majority of the population they governed. That alienation would prove fatal. In 1204, a Turkish general named Bakhtiar Khilji led a vanguard of just 17 heavily armored horsemen, crashing straight through the wooden doors of the royal palace. The attack was so small and brazen that the aging king Lakshman Sena was reportedly sitting down to eat his lunch, completely unaware that an invasion had even begun. The surprise strike sparked immediate panic. The guards offered virtually no resistance, the capital surrendered without a siege, and the king fled by boat to the eastern frontier. Without the mass popular support that had sustained the Palas for centuries, the capital became a hollow shell. When the palace doors were breached, there was no popular mobilization to save the dynasty. The city simply watched as its rulers fled. The physical remnants of Bengal's early medieval period tell a story of two very different approaches to power. The Pala kings sponsored centuries of prosperous trade and learning through broad inclusion. The Senas fractured that foundation with rigid exclusion. A state's resilience depends on more than its hoard of gold or its walls. Internal segregation makes an empire brittle, ensuring that a single tactical surprise becomes a terminal blow. It takes 400 years of cooperation to build a magnificent civilization. It takes only 18 horsemen to shatter a divided one.